Alright, I'm at the Plains Railway in Turnbull, mid-Canterbury. I've got my signal lamp that they've lent me, and this is episode K of Rakaia, 1899. Thomas Danks was seated in the fifth carriage back from U284. And like most of the carriages on that train, he was likely in longitudinal seating rather than the lateral seating that we have in this example. As an old railway man, he had an ear for whistles. When he heard the whistle for down brakes, he turned to his son Jack and said, "There's trouble brewing." He was right about that. There was trouble brewing. The question is, though, whether or not it had been brewing for the last 40 minutes or for the last 20 years. Mr. Danks didn't notice any pull from the brake van, and with good reason. It had been on for at least a couple of miles, and so there was no fresh pull of that brake to notice. When Frank cut in the tender air and when Harry cut in the locomotive's brakes, Thomas and Jack and all of their fellow passengers noticed their own momentum as the braking power of U284 began to retard the second picnic train's progress. And then came the shock of collision. And that's it pretty much for the passengers in the second picnic train. There was a shock, but there wasn't much more. William Hudson was probably in the first class compartment of the leading six-wheel carriage, carriage number 28. Although he says in his evidence that he was in the trailing six-wheel carriage, number 29, but there's plenty of reasons why that is exceedingly unlikely, and I'll touch on those reasons in a subsequent episode. He says there was a tremendous bump, followed by another bump. Then all he could see was a mass of broken timber. He was thrown out of his seat and into the one in front of him, where he was pinned down by some debris. He cried out, "Where are you, Len? Are you hurt?" But he got no answer. Two men came into the compartment after a short period of time and pulled him and some of the others out. Charlotte Pearce, the 11-year-old from Papanui travelling with her family, was standing at the time of the collision. She was knocked backwards and had the misfortune of colliding with a spittoon. So, insult and injury for young Charlotte. According to his evidence, Mr. Jeffs, the farmer of Templeton, was seated with his back to the door about 5 cars from the end of the first picnic train. His evidence is that he was knocked so hard against the door handle that he was knocked stupid. His words, not mine. Annie Franks, Fanny Jones, Rose Harwood and little Richard Bowden were passengers in the first class compartment of the American-style carriage. There's a concept in collision investigation called survivable volume, and what that means is the length, breadth and height of any given compartment that are carrying people. And the reality for those 4 passengers and their travelling companions in that first class compartment is that it had its survivable volume significantly compromised. That compromise came from the trailing buffer beam of the trailing six-wheel carriage. That buffer beam entered Annie and Fanny and Rose and Richard's compartment at about shin height behind me here. It inclined upwards. It came to a rest about a third of the way into the carriage at chest height. It demolished everything it touched. And odds are that Annie, Fanny, Rose and Richard were seated in this part of that compartment. Its survivable volume essentially decreased to so close to nil as to make no odds. The collision at Rakaia was, at the point of impact, a collision in slow motion. So it would have taken a couple of seconds perhaps for that buffer beam to slide through the car and come to a rest. So the passengers in the car would have been aware that their world had become very, very different to the world they were used to. And for 4 of the passengers, Rose, Annie, Fanny and Richard, it ended their lives. Such was the lottery of decisions about which of the 2 trains to catch, or which carriage to sit in, or which compartment. If there had been 2 carriages that way, along with young Mr. Hudson, they likely would have survived. If they had been in the second class compartment instead of the first, where there were no fatalities, similarly their chances of survival would also have been much higher. But the significant difference between the destruction of every other carriage and this section of the American style carriage is the presence of that buffer beam. And it, for those 4 people, was the difference between life and death in the colony's worst railway disaster. Like, subscribe, enjoy, don't enjoy, up to you. But whatever you're doing, next time you come through mid-Canterbury, make sure you call in and check out the K.